Yes,
Yes,
perfect.
so thank you for having me today. My name is Russell Horsey and I'm an arboriculturalist. I've been practicing now for about 25 years and I now run a small consultancy. We're a team of 3 and we specialise in sort of working and modernising the sector with new software, but also at least half our work is with community engagement. And that's come about in essence, I guess, because of my journey. And so I'm going to kind of take you on a bit of a journey today in terms of why urban forestry and why community engagement. I was lucky enough back in 2000 to win some scholarships. So I was lucky enough to go out to Toronto to do my master's. And it kind of opened my eyes a bit. And I think in some respects, the sector here is slightly behind in terms of community engagement. If we look to North America, you know, and including Canada, they're much more advanced. There's a lot more not-for-profits out there. There's a lot more philanthropy. There's a lot more people wanting to give money to tree planting. And I think, you know, I think we can look to America and we can take and we can take what they do and I think bring it across here. And I think I'm starting to see a lot more of that. So as a consultancy now, we work, we provide advice to the Woodland Trust Urban team to help them with their urban engagement. We provide advice to a number of different groups around the country. I've helped advise the group at Sheffield when they're having issues up there. We're working, and I'll talk a bit later about Northampton with Save Our Street Trees, who again is a small group that's basically come up because they wanted to see more trees going back into their streets. We're working with groups in Neath, we're working groups near Cardiff. So what I am starting to see is more and more groups wanting to engage, but I think we're lacking a skill set in the sector, and many tree officers don't have that skill set. It's not something that's trained and it's not something that's taught. So, you know, even when I was out in North America, community engagement wasn't really something we covered. You know, we were taught about how you plant a tree, you know, how you make sure you deal with other professionals, but we weren't really taught about that community engagement. And I think it's something that's missing. So most of you guys will have done some tree planting, and the picture there, we've got the ladies from Save Swansea's Trees. And we took a bunch of our community groups down to a nursery that we work with, Hillier Nurseries, basically to show them about big trees. And one of the ladies mentioned earlier about meeting with a local tree officer and talking about the differences between big and little trees. Well, possibly something that we need to do is we need to take some of those officers down to these nurseries so they can understand the differences. You know, it's not easy to ramp up supply and demand. You know, so demand can ramp up very quickly. It's very difficult for the nurseries to ramp up their supply. With the smaller whips, potentially within 2 or 3 years, with a big amount of investment, you can start to ramp up with supply. But the trees you see there that group are looking at, they've probably been lifted 4 or 5 times in their life so far. And what the nursery does is it lifts the tree out of the ground every 2 or 3 years as it transplants it. It cuts the roots back. And in this case, these trees have then been put into a bag, basically to allow us to start to plant earlier. But I mean, those trees could be anywhere between 8 and 12 years old, depending on the species. So, you know, we need to start to think the long game. And one of the reasons it's been challenging is because across the sector, a lot of people are doing spot buying. So year on year, budgets have been up and budgets have been down. And so what happens is you spot buy at the nurseries. And so the nurseries haven't been able to forward plan. And I know you guys are working closely with the city, but I think, again, if you can work closely with your suppliers and if you can guarantee supply, then actually that will allow the nurseries to expand. That, you know, this nursery in question is just basically last year gone out and brought another 300-acre farm to start to plant up with more trees, but we will probably not see any of that production for another 4 or 5 years. As we know, planting trees is really easy. We put them in at that size. In a few years, they start to look like the street trees. No problems. If only that was so, you know, if only that was the case. So when I finished my master's, I took the train out west. I had a bit of time on my hands and I walked through some national parks down the west coast of the States. And then I was staying with some friends in San Francisco, and I went into San Francisco to do a 10K running race. And I started to see all these new street trees everywhere. And they were all branded up with something called Friends of the Urban Forest, which I'd never heard of, never come across. And basically, Friends of the Urban Forest was one of the first not-for-profits across the world. And basically, San Francisco, so if you've ever been to San Francisco, 95% of the trees in San Francisco were not planted by the city. They were planted by residents. And they were literally planted by residents. So basically, the sidewalk outside your house in San Francisco historically it's up to you to maintain. And so the not-for-profit started in the 70s because it recognized that San Francisco needed trees. And it was all about shade. You know, San Francisco gets very hot. It is coastal, but it was all about planting shade. So the not-for-profit started up and basically once or twice a week, they basically go out to different neighborhoods and they go out and plant trees. They use a guy to come and cut a big hole in the tarmac, or in this case, the concrete. And then they go and procure the trees, and then they actually get the residents out on the street planting. Now they're slightly lucky in that their pavements are not full of utilities like we have here, but you can get residents out planting. And these are some trees I planted in 2000, and this photo was taken 12 years later. And I heard earlier about planting whips is good. Yes, it is, but planting standards is equally as good, because you can start to get quite good results as long as you look after your trees really quickly. And so to me, that kind of started to open my eyes to the need to engage with the communities, because here we had a city that wasn't planting literally at that time, and it's only been within the last 5 years this has changed. There were literally only about 5 streets in San Francisco where the trees were owned and maintained and had been planted by the city. That changed about 5 years ago, in that the city finally decided to take on ownership of all these trees and to start to manage them. And that was done when the local residents all voted. So basically every year when it's election times, you have what's called the different propositions, and you kind of vote to where we're going to raise taxes for pavements, or we're going to raise taxes for street trees, or we're going to raise taxes for everything. And you say yes or no. And basically this not-for-profit had been funded partly by philanthropy and partly by these propositions, and the city eventually, because of complaints by everybody, has now taken on and appointed its first urban forester. So I think, to me, again, that shows the power of people, because the city, which has hadn't planted trees for 25 years, now has an urban forester, now has an urban forestry management plan, now is starting to manage its trees. It also taught me a bit about philanthropy, because most of the people that were coming out and planting weren't rich people, and we planted all over the city, but they were people that wanted to improve their neighborhood. And even 20 years ago, people understood that the trees were good. And trees are a bit of a difficult one, if I'm honest. They do too many good things. And as a sector, sometimes I think we struggle, because when I'm talking to a highways professional, he probably doesn't care that the tree is flowery and lovely and aesthetically pleasing. He's interested in potentially, does it remove pollution? Could it slow traffic down? So I think the thing that working in San Francisco taught to me was, depending on where I was and depending on who I was speaking to, I needed to change the language I was using to deal with the people that I was dealing with. And I think that's really important, and something I've continued since I've working here. I came back to the UK. I spent some time at Epping Forest working in planning. I then went to Kensington and Chelsea for a year, where there was unlimited amounts of money, but no space to put any new trees. So, there was loads of money for pruning trees. We were losing about 200 a year. We had more than enough money to replace, but that they'd run out of space. There is literally no space in Kensington to put new trees. But wherever you go, I see poor planting. And I think that's what's really disappointing. An example there of, a tie that's been left on a tree far too long. And to be honest, that tree's probably only been in a year. Planes grow really quickly. That kind of planting, it just doesn't work. We see crossbars where kids come along and snap the trees. So again, it's really important to think about how you plant. And the picture on the right might not look problematic, but it's very typical of what we saw in the 70s and the late 80s, in that too many trees are planted too close together, and cities just don't have the money to thin them out. And that leads to problems, in that you end up with trees that have poor form. They're never going to become those big canopy trees we want. So I'm a big advocate of planting less, plant it better, and look after it. And longer term, that's what we look to do. So I ran Bristol Tree Team for 7 years, and basically, because we had a legacy, and every city has this legacy of all these trees that we can never thin because we just don't have the money, we started to change our planting to try and plant at final spacings. And so our standards went in at final spacings to save ourselves money, and I'll come on to that. And partly that's around education. Landscape architects are taught to plant in odd numbers. So they plant in groups of 3s, 5s, 7s, 9s, 11s, and etc. And that kind of works with shrubs, because if you lose the occasional shrub, it doesn't matter in a shrub belt, because the rest of the shrubs fill in. But actually with trees, it's a big waste of resources, and B, you just end up with these trees that are poor. And the issue is that, if you put these trees in groups and you come to then try and thin out 10 or 15 years, the public get very upset with you, because they don't understand why you're removing decent, healthy trees. And it's very difficult at that point to explain, well, if I don't take out half the trees, the other half of the trees are never going to get big. And so I think, again, that to me was a big thing to look at. You guys are doing some amazing work, and you guys are massively far ahead, I think, in Birmingham in terms of what you're doing. I mean, when I took over at Bristol, and on the top left was what we eventually got. We didn't know where any of our trees were. I had laminated sheets, which showed me where all my street trees were. We had no computer system. I didn't know where any of my housing trees were. I didn't know where any of my education trees were. So one of the first things we did was we mapped all our trees. It was really important in order to do anything well, and just to, to try and free up some time to do planting, we had to try and stop some of the complaints we were getting. At the time I started, we had 3.5 of us, and we had 3,500 requests for service, or complaints as you would understand them, coming in. It was an impossible workload. So by mapping our trees, by being able to pass that information to our customer services, we could start to get rid of some of those complaints. When people phoned up and said, when is my tree being pruned? That didn't come to an officer, somebody could answer that. And some of the work we're moving on now, where you can start to show the monetary benefits of trees, is a great way of trying to explain to people that may not understand why trees are good. They may have had a bad experience with a tree, and so therefore they may not want trees. And dealing with that public perception, I think, is also a big issue. Over 7 years, we went from 3.5 to 11.5 people. We mapped all our trees. We knew where all our trees were, which meant it was brilliant when it came to planting, because we could start to see what trees we were to make sure we weren't planting too many of new species. So again, that was really helpful. We broke down budgets in terms of where they were based. We were spending £900,000 a year, but we broke out our planting budget, and that was done to be tactical, to be honest. Politicians don't like to cut tree planting budgets, but it's very easy for a politician when they're looking for budget cuts to say, Russell, find me a 5% saving on £900,000. Whereas, you start to break your budgets down and go, well, do you want me to cut money out of the highways tree planting budget? No, not going to do that. And the same. So we were quite tactical in that we broke our budgets into smaller pots so that it made us much easier to defend from political cuts. I'll talk about Tree Bristol in a moment, which is a way we look to bring extra money in. And I'm also going to talk about capital infrastructure projects, because DEFRA, which is where we get most of our money for tree planting, or most people think about getting our tree planting money from, is tiny in comparison to other government departments. Department for Transport has 10 times the budget that DEFRA has. Department for Health has 10 times the amount of money that DFT has. So we need to start thinking about where our money's coming from, and actually big capital infrastructure projects are where potentially you can get money for tree planting, and you can get money to hit those sites that potentially you can't do within your normal fundraising. Where are our costs? These are average costs at the moment, going back into an existing tree plit or going into a grass verge. Okay, so you're looking at the moment, tree prices have gone up significantly in the past 18 months, and I think they're only going one way because there's a shortage. So we spend probably an average of £150 on a tree. You spend more for a containerized tree, and the reason you'd use a containerized tree initially is because you can start to plant in early November, whereas for most bare root trees, you can't potentially get those until the first frost, so you can't get them to December. However, if you can plant with bare root, even with community groups, as long as you work with community groups and teach them what to do, planting bare root trees, even at a decent size like the ones in the photo, isn't an issue. But in my experience, there are some trees that don't like going in bare root: birch trees, oak trees, tulip trees, and I'd always plant those in containers because they do much better. There's a failure rate when you containerize trees for some of these species, and by buying them alive from the nursery's sort of taken that risk away, and the trees just do better. We use what you can see in the photos, so we use stakes and a wild mesh guard, and that's to avoid vandalism. I'd much rather have people coming in attacking the wild mesh guards than attacking my trees. I did have a site once where we planted it up with HSBC, and overnight all the wild mesh guards were stolen for ferret runs. It turned out in the end, when we talked to the police, we could see these guards in neighbouring gardens, but we hadn't put anything on them to say they belong to the city. So the police said, well, it's your word against their word. And we're like, well, here are the photos yesterday of all these wild mesh guards on these trees in a park, and now they're not in the park, and look, there's loads of wild mesh guards over there. So we had to think creatively. So we got more wild mesh guards, and we cut little holes in all the wild mesh guards so the ferrets would escape, and they were left on the tree. So sometimes you just have to think a little bit creatively. We used tree pans, which is the device that's gone around the base of the tree. It stops you needing mulch. It basically kills off all the grass and weed competition because it's so dark underneath, and it funnels water towards the tree. And we also use carbon gold, which is a biochar product, because it's been shown to decrease stress. And then watering, we water all our trees for 3 years. It's a must when you're planting trees at this size, and if you go even bigger, it can be up to 5 years. If you're doing it through a contractor, it could be £75 plus a year. If you're doing it with community groups, which I'm a big advocate of as well, I think you can reduce your costs, and we'll talk about that. But that's £500 a tree. And here lies the challenge. The sector and a lot of the charities, the bigger charities, are all about numbers. Politicians are all about numbers. We just heard Gloucestershire Council. We're going to plant, I think it was, I don't know, was it 3 million trees in the next 10 years? And then someone went, you're a highways authority. Do you have enough land to plant that? And they've done 10,000 last year. So, you know, what you're doing in terms of mapping where you're potentially going to plant, I think is really important. We need to explain to politicians that it's not about numbers. Numbers sound amazing, but a number of councils are currently setting themselves up to fail because it's just going to be impossible, A, for them to get the stock, and B, for them to plant. And, you know, 1,000 whips as a hedge is amazing, but potentially, I don't know, 100 standard trees will produce more, you know, benefits longer term if they're planted well. We need to take other professionals on the journey with us. On the left is a picture of a cherry that was probably put in the 60s or 70s. At the time, cherries were all grafted onto a rootstock that was really invasive and basically grew. And you know, there are you can come across historic cherry trees where the stem is tiny and the roots are massive. So if you turn around to a highways engineer and say, I'd like to put cherries on your street, you can just see the blood draining from their face because their experience of cherry trees is large rooting trees that might be damaging their drains. Now, things have moved on. The nursery industry has realized this was an issue and they've changed the rooting stock we put cherries on, so that doesn't happen. But, you know, has anyone told the highways engineer this? So, you know, we need to take them with us. And on the right is a project out in New York. I was lucky enough about 10 years ago to get invited out to New York to look at their Million Trees campaign. And there they were spending £3.5 million a year replacing pavement with the trees in situ. And they were looking at standards and going, okay, in some cases we won't meet our standard, we'll make that pavement slightly smaller. So again, you know, it's about working with politicians, it's about working with other professionals to take them on the journey. New York taught me a lot though, because the mayor set their Million Tree project, and what we saw in the States, which I think is where we're at now, is in the States we have lots of mayors and they were all chatting about big numbers. So Chicago started with Mayor Daley, he did his million. New York said we'll do 1 million, Los Angeles said they'll do 1 million, everybody said we'll do 1 million because it was a nice round number. And how many of those trees have survived? And I think that's really important. It's about tree survival. We can plant lots of numbers, but if they don't survive, we're just wasting resources. And I went out to New York because there was the project was split in two. The city was planting street trees and basically had a target over 10 years to plant 300,000 street trees. And basically the mayor said, everywhere my officers come, they will put a street tree in. And they did. And where it worked, it was amazing. But they did some research about 4 years into the project, which showed that 30% of the trees were disappearing and they didn't know where they were going because there was no community engagement. So suddenly residents that had never had street trees were just having street trees thrown outside their house. And so some of them were disappearing. Possibly some may have gone into back gardens. Probably some ended up in the bin. And again, you know, that lack of community engagement was a big issue. Yet at the same time, Bette Midler was leading the philanthropic part of that bid, which was 700,000 trees going into parks. And I got invited out to a bar down in the centre of New York to meet both parties. But it was a bit like a school disco because the girls were on one side and the boys were on the other side. When the city was on one side and the philanthropic lot were on the other side, and they didn't talk to each other. And I did, and it didn't go down too well because, like, you know, Tree Bristol, we wanted to do both. I wanted to learn from both. And it transpired that the city weren't very impressed with the not-for-profit because the not-for-profit, they planted rubbish trees, Russell. They don't know what they're doing. Their stock's rubbish. And then you talk to the not-for-profit and they were like, but the city doesn't talk to anyone and they're rubbish. And it's like, guys, share knowledge. You know, they can help you with procurement and buying better trees and you can help them with communities. Again, you know, a good example of officers that were really stretched, had such big targets to hit. They didn't have time for community engagement, but, you know, if they'd have taken community groups with them, it made the project much more successful. I took over Bristol, and it's fair to say that public perception of the city wasn't very good. The city historically had put forward a number of sort of scatterbrained schemes. Before I arrived, they said they were going to basically take the busy cycle route that runs between Bristol and Bath, and they were going to turn it into a bus lane. That went down like a lead balloon. So the city had a habit of not doing much community engagement, and so I basically inherited a team with a bad, not my team with a bad perception, but there was a bad perception of Bristol. And this is a good example. We got contacted by an owner who said, you've got a tiny oak tree, it's growing next to my brick wall, it's going to damage the brick wall. It was a tiny pocket park, and we went up and looked at it and went, yeah, okay, it's not damaging at the moment, but I can see your issue. So we did a lot of community consultation. We came up with a new scheme. We found space for about 7 or 8 new trees. And we did a community planting. We got the local civic society group out, we got the local schools out. And so on the Thursday, the 8th of March, Leafy Future, as Bristol Council worked with residents to put 7 new trees in. And we thought, brilliant, that's amazing. And then we took out the little oak tree, and exactly a week later, Anger's beautiful oak tree has felled. Now, the depressing thing about this is it's the same residents and the same children that we planted with. Okay, they've had a week in school. They've done a lovely picture of a little devil with a chainsaw and the Bristol City logo in the middle of his belly. And they've taken a photo with a wide-angled lens that makes that look like a veteran tree. It wasn't. It was about that big. But if you get really close to the wide-angle lens, it really, it really does make it. So I got hauled in by my director. What's going on? And we kind of were able to say, well, we've done engagement. We knew that people weren't happy about this coming out because they didn't want to see trees, but I couldn't leave it there. It's going to cause damage, and we put 7 back in. So I guess you can't please everyone all the time, and sometimes we do have to take trees out. But I think it's important that we are replacing with more than 1 for 1. As a result of this, when I took over Bristol, I thought that what I was going to find. So Bristol's a city. It's very hilly, lots of heavy clay soils. I thought subsidence was going to be the biggest threat to my trees. I'd come from London. Subsidence was a big issue. We were seeing lots of trees being felled, both in the highway and in public areas. But actually, our biggest risk was that we weren't replacing trees because we didn't have any money. And that was a challenge because politically, we didn't have enough money to manage our trees. And so what historically had happened was the planting budget had been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed until there was very little money. And we were doing a token planting of 100 trees a year, but at the same time, we were probably felling 300 trees in the highway, plus others. And we wanted to find a way around that. So one of the first things we did was we set up a project called Tree Bristol. And the idea behind Tree Bristol was that we wanted to try and start to bring money in. Now, it was a city-led project, but we branded it as if it wasn't. Tree planting, as you all appreciate, everyone loves to come out for a tree planting. Businesses love to give money to tree planting, but they potentially wouldn't, and our experience was they wouldn't be interested if it was linked to the city. So we completely branded it as a complete new brand to try and separate it out from the rest of the management, and it worked well. We weren't very good. I didn't really understand marketing, and actually if we'd have had more community engagement probably earlier on, we'd have had some marketeers hopefully within our community groups that could have helped us, because this was how we launched Tree Bristol. So firstly, I got told off because the council said I had to have this long-winded website which no one could ever take on. So I had a company credit card at the time which we used for filling up our van. So I just brought treebristol.com because I thought it was simple. So we tried to launch. We hauled a sofa to the middle of one of our parks. We got some of our standard trees in pots and stuck it behind, and we put Tree Bristol on a laptop. Although we didn't put the website on, so that was our first mistake. The press weren't really interested. They didn't kind of get it. We hadn't really got it. And we invited people out to come and try and launch it. Now, this is a good photo of Spot the Politician. Okay, so we have 2 politicians and we have one resident member of our residents group, and the politicians are the one that when you point a camera at them, they smile, whereas the poor Hugh was just sat there going, I'm sat between 2 politicians, what's going on? I don't really understand. So again, any way you can get publicity, any publicity can be good. But again, we didn't have any marketing. When I wasn't taught marketing at school, and no tree officer I know will have been. So if we've got marketing professionals in your group, use them to help you market your brand, because it really will take you forwards really quickly. As I said, we changed our specification. So our specification did away with the crossbar. Everything was caged, even if it didn't need it, because it costs slightly more money. It's costing us £30 at the time. It's probably about £20 a cage. But actually, the demoralization for having a tree snapped is more damaging, I think, than caging all our trees. And you can reuse the cages. So our specification was to put in bigger trees, work with community groups. There's Hugh again, much more happy now because he doesn't know the camera's facing him, and he's out with residents planting, and that's brilliant. So we changed our specification, and we did away with the crossbar. It had been a standard specification in Bristol to have a crossbar, but we were seeing too many trees being snapped. Again, too many trees attached to a crossbar, which was then never removed, and then they get damaged. So our specification was basically, if we could, 14 to 16 centimeter, 18 centimeter diameter trees, 3 to 4 meters tall. a high double weld mesh guard so that you can't literally get in and snap the top, mulch and 3 years watering, and it works really well. And we started to try and pick the right tree for the right location. So this was a cycle scheme where there was a new cycle route going in, and the green trees are the historic ones from the 70s. As you can see, they're all really close together. And the yellow trees, limey yellow trees, are the ones we put in. And basically those trees were going in at final spacings. And so for larger trees, we were looking at 50 to 20 meters between each tree for final spacings. Now the reason for that is we want to look at the final crown spread of the tree. And so for medium-sized trees, you were looking at 10 to 12 meters. And then for smaller trees, you were looking at anywhere between 7 and 10 meters. And it is very species dependent. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to allow the tree enough space, because the nursery's invested a lot of time in pruning and getting those bigger trees into a good structure. And what you want to do is you want those trees to grow up and out with as limited intervention as possible. Trees don't like pruning. So if we can put them in positions where they don't need pruning, then that will, over time, decrease the amount of money you have to spend on management. And so that was really important to us. It also meant we weren't going to have this issue. So you can see those green ones there, and they're already close together. Now, in theory, every other one of those should now be felled. That's an additional cost, as well as being a waste of resources. It's an additional cost. So we were just trying to stop that as well. And we started to involve the community. Tree Bristol to us was about involving the community. It was about getting schools out. It was about getting businesses out. It was about getting out local groups, local parts groups. And actually, sometimes it's not about the tree. You know, this is a group of children. This was a couple of acre park in East Bristol. Some of these children live 2 or 3 streets away from this park, and they didn't even know it existed. Okay, so actually a lot of the community engagement is about getting more people into our parks. It's about getting people to take ownership so the trees aren't damaged. You know, we found, and there is research that shows, if you engage younger children in tree planting, their teenage siblings are much less likely to vandalize them because there's ownership. They know that they're a sibling help plant. So again, but sometimes for the kids, actually, it's just about digging a hole. It's about getting dirty. You know, as for most of you that have done tree planting, you'll know that that's the start of the planting. The kids don't usually go home looking that clean. They usually go home. Some of them, at least one, will roll around in the mud from head to foot and just be absolutely covered. But that's brilliant. Possibly not if you're a parent, but for me, it was great. You know. And we involve businesses. Businesses are desperate to give money to good causes. And for cities, if they've got a good program where they can see their money isn't going to go off to something else and it's ring fenced tree planting, they will give you lots of money. Okay, they need to. But again, we needed to take some learning from businesses. So you possibly can't see our Tree Bristol poster because it's the size of an A4 sheet. Whereas the business went, no, this is how you do marketing. You put a big sign in. Okay. So again, we learned. We branded our helmets because we saw businesses were doing it. We branded our high-vis jackets because businesses were doing it, and businesses are doing it for a reason. And you know, we need to copy those practices. So we were slowly learning. And eventually we did start to get better. You know, our photos, or this one for some reason doesn't seem to be in focus. You know, we started to have bigger Tree Bristol banners. I still was having to advertise this long-winded local government website which no one could understand or put in, and eventually we got rid of that. But you know, again, you know, it was about us trying to learn that every time we could, we got the press out to something. And you know, these are lots of different politicians. And we have to get political. As a sector, we are absolutely appalling. If I look at why there's lots of new cycle lanes, if I look at why the government keeps giving cyclists money, it's because the engineers and the cyclists are very good at lobbying. And as a green sector, we've been really poor to engage with politicians. We've been very poor to lobby. And I'm afraid we do have to lobby. And that's a challenge as an officer, because as an officer, you're told you can influence politicians, but you can't lobby them. And it's a very fine tightrope, because I'm still not sure which side is lobbying and which side is influencing. So in this picture, I've got the mayor. You know, mayors love to come out and, you know, cut ribbons and plant trees. So that's good. Press like coming out and taking photos of the mayor. But then I've been cross-political. So at Bristol, I ended up with a tree champion within every political party. So it didn't matter which political party was in, they wanted to work with us. And you can see there's some I know the politicians there, and if you look, some of them aren't very happy to be stood next to another politician, but it's tough. I was open to all politicians because I wanted all politicians to come out. So again, it's, you know, photo opportunities, getting children out. And it's a good way as a tree officer also to start to engage with your politicians, because a lot of them don't really know about what you do. And so as a tree officer, sometimes their only experience of you is you're that awkward tree officer that keeps saying, no, you're not going to fell trees, because that's all they get in their you know, in their mail load is somebody complaining about why aren't they taking down trees. And hopefully you all know the gentleman with the white hair, David Bellamy. Okay, so again, we do need some more celebrities. So if anybody knows good younger celebrities that we can start to use, because Dave is getting a bit old to wheel around the country nowadays. But David Bellamy came out at the time, and this was 15 years ago. It was amazing having him out. The press heard he was coming to Bristol. They came, they talked. These trees were sponsored by a company that had redone all the kitchens in those flats, and they gave us money for trees. This was probably one of the most carbon intensive trees I've ever planted, because what I hadn't realized was David had actually been in Birmingham earlier that morning planting a tree, possibly with you guys, and then he was flown down to Bristol, jumped in a taxi, came and planted our tree, and then they taxied him back to Bristol, and he jumped in a helicopter up to London because it was during National Tree Week, so he was engaged to plant everywhere. But if you looked in the local press, David was in 3 different places in one day. So again, it's a great way of getting publicity, but we don't seem to have many champions at a younger age. We maybe aren't talking to influencers. And, I think that's where, for tree planting to go forwards, we need to influence more people. And planting less gives you less stress. And I've added biomass, actually. So I heard the lady asked about biomass and the concern. So biomass is a challenging thing. So what you can see there is some very old poplars that were in a line. We took them down and replaced them with tulip trees, and we have left the stems in place. And we try to do this where possible for kids to play on. And then we also use stems to go around the edge of parks to stop people driving into parks. So we used to, I don't know whether you get it in Birmingham, possibly. We used to get a lot of children stealing cars, driving them around, and as soon as the police got near them, they used to drive them into the park, slam them into one of our trees and set light to them, which then also set light to the tree and killed it. So what we started to do is started to put these massive stems around the edges of our open parks to stop that happening. We also used to sell our biomass, and we did that for a reason, because it brought extra income into us, and it meant that our rates were cheaper. And if we hadn't included that, and we were the first council, I think, in the country to do this, most councils at the time were not even considering this. So yes, I think there's a challenge here, is that if you've got tree works going on and you're going to have to take trees down anyway, you need to make the best of the biomass, and that could be leaving them around, or it could be selling it. But I think the risk is you don't want to be clearing all your woodlands to produce biomass, but then potentially if you're thinning woodlands, maybe you will. So I think it's a bit of a tightrope. But biomass is a market where we can sell wood chip that historically would have just gone onto a farmer's field. So look at it in terms of could it be beneficial to what you do? A lot of councils are worried about running community events. It's not something they've done. They think it's quite difficult, and it's not easy. It needs a lot of work. I mean, we were putting in 50 to 60 trees per day, and realistically, that's the most you can get away with doing, I think. And we'd need 5 or 6 transit vans full of gear. We'd have a couple of transit vans that would be covered with trees. We'd have all our tools in the middle on tool safes. We'd have wheelbarrows on another one. And it involves a lot of time and a lot of thought. And the reason we were using small transit vans is because whilst I could have got a bigger lorry to get everything to site, most of our parks footpaths are not, they can't really take anything more. And it involves a bit of learning. We used to, when we first started doing it, we'd send the trees out with enough spades to go to one part of the park, and it just didn't work. So you need to think about it. You need to know what you've got, and you need to make sure then you've got enough people to drive. That's the biggest issue now, is especially within most councils, is most younger people don't have the ability to drive these vehicles on their licenses. We were quite lucky in the time we had grandfather rights. Oh, brilliant. The nursery has sent us a bigger tree at no extra cost. Aren't they amazing? Well, not if you then got to try and hump the tree around a park. Basically we were looking at 45 to 60 litre trees was the most that, if we were going to get containerized trees, that we could carry. And the tree in question there is in like a 90 litre pot. That was needing 3 or 4 people to try and drag that around the park. So again, it's working with your suppliers so that they, rather than, because the nursery thinks, well, I'm sending you a bigger pot, what damage is that going to cause? Well, quite a lot if you need to suddenly get a crane in to move the tree around. So again, it's you need to work with your nurseries to make sure that they understand that if they can't get you the tree you've ordered, they need to tell you so you can swap it for another one. Please just don't send bigger trees, because we also learned in the early days that having a delivery the day before your tree planting led to issues like this, where we didn't know where these bigger trees turned up. and then, oops, the park's locked and no one's got any keys. So how do we get those trees off the truck and into the park without damaging them? So, again, things can go wrong. So, how do you prepare? We always planted no matter what the weather, whether it rained, whether it snowed. And we always sent out information to teachers. I love teachers. They have a very hard job. But sometimes I think they're so busy that maybe they haven't read the information we've sent them. And so we've had a number of occasions where the teachers are desperate to get back to school because they're frozen, because they haven't actually dressed up warmly, or they haven't worn welly boots, and they haven't brought hats. But the kids, just want to stay. So again, work with teachers to say that, look, we will plant no matter what the weather. Even if it is snowing, we are going to plant. Because people will come out, and I think that's the other thing about building a community program. People need to know you're going to be there, even on a bad day. And on some bad days, people won't turn up, and you'll end up having to do a lot of the work yourselves as volunteers and officers. But it's important to be consistent. I don't think we've ever had to cancel an event that I can think of. I think maybe possibly one, but yeah, we've always run events. We also need to think about how and who we engage with. So we had a site in South Bristol where a group of teenage girls had come along. Some contractors had put trees in as part of a new playground, and they snapped the tops of all the trees because they weren't protected with the cages. So we worked with local schools, we worked with the local police, and we basically got young offenders out to replant those trees, including the girls that had snapped the trees. So the girls' parents had been taken to court, they'd been fined, but we said, okay, we're going to get them out. Now, I don't know if you can see the young boy at the bottom. His feet are pretty much in an inch of mud already. It was quite a wet site. So probation services turned up with some kids, the local policeman turned up with some children, and we kind of said, okay, we're going to plant some trees. There was lots of swearing on behalf of the young children. They were all threatening each other, and they were all, trying to be the biggest person in the park. And they were also exceptionally rude to the policeman, which I was a bit shocked at, actually. That was kind of an eye-opening experience for me. Yet we treated them with respect. And myself and Matt in the picture said, we showed them how to do it. This is how we're going to plant a tree. And partway through the day, we were getting, are we doing this all right, sir? And, if treated with respect, they really got into it. I mean, the policeman's eyes dropped when we said we're going to give them all hammers, because his experience of giving them hammers was they probably would go and break windows or do something. But we said no, that's fine. And when we gave them pickaxes, why do they need pickaxes? Well, that's what we need to plant with, so we're going to give them the tools to do the job. I have to say those are probably 10 of the safest trees in the world, because if I was another young person and I was going to go and vandalize some trees, I wouldn't be vandalizing those trees, because those 15 young people, by God, they were scary. And yeah, so actually we didn't really have any other residents come out. We just had those people come out and plant with us. And yeah, as I say, it's an area where those are some of the safest trees now in Bristol, so do not touch them. And this is what final spacing starts to look like. So here we've got an oak avenue. We've set it back from the paths so people can see what's going on. Historically, I think there's been a lot of trees put too close to paths. Then people get worried about perception. They want to be able to see. The other benefit of final spacing is people can see in between the trees. And there are perceptions in parts of cities where people are not used to walking near trees. They are worried about people, jumping out. We had issues on our cycle paths of people being mugged where they were hiding behind trees because the trees were just too close to the path. So this allows an open vista you can see through, and the trees have gone in. And actually what's also really interesting now is 10 years later, you can start to see along the middle there, the tree canopies. So those trees have been well maintained, and they're already starting to produce a decent sized canopy. And that to me is, because now at the time we couldn't really map any of this. The mapping, the pixelation was really poor. But now with the work you're doing, actually you'll start to see the fruits of your labor. You're going to start to measure those things. And I think that's a really powerful message. And we were struggling with politicians. Why can't Russell, I want to plant 1,000 trees in this park. And it's like, yeah, but it can't take 1,000 trees. We can put 60 trees in an avenue here. We can do another 50 down the bottom. But actually, I don't want to completely fill the park with woodlands. I don't really want to completely fill the park just for a numbers game. This needs to be a workable park. There are other parts of the park. Yes, I could plant on the football pitches, but they're all going to get vandalized, and where are the kids going to play football? So, we need to think about this numbers target, or we do run the risk of, where are you going to plant the trees? Look for quick wins. Grass verges are usually a quick win, to be honest. And so we, historically in Bristol, we'd been losing trees that we hadn't replaced. So this road had trees in the 70s and 80s. And then over the next 20 or 30 years, those trees had disappeared. So we went in, we did a lot of consultation, and we ran a consultation with the residents to say, we're going to give you a choice of 3 trees. Which of these 3 trees would you like, and we'll go with the most. And the benefit of doing it that way was we as officers got to pick the species, so that we knew that we could manage it. We knew that it wasn't going to cause problems, and we were looking in this street for very upright trees, and they went for a cherry. We had a number of residents that had bad experiences. They'd had purple plums, which had gone massive. They were, too big, too wide, causing damage and all sorts. And so a number of residents said in the first year, please, we don't want trees. And we said, okay, fine, we'll just plant the ones that where we've had yeses. Year 2, we came and did the same. And then in year 3, we started getting people going, can I have one of those trees now from year 1? Because they'd seen that they were smaller trees, they were upright trees, they weren't going to cause damages, they were pretty, and they really liked it. And so that way of community engagement to me is a really good way of using professional knowledge in terms of your tree officers, in terms of, what can we manage? You can't really put plane trees or oak trees there. There isn't space for it. It's going to cause problems. But actually an upright cherry planted at a decent spacing, you grow it for 40 or 50 years, and then you take it out when it dies and you put another one back in, and that's sustainable. We did some research at Bristol where we had a lot of unsustainable trees, and we were having to constantly pollard them every 3 years because they were too big for the location. And our research showed that potentially for every pollarded tree that was in a bad location that we took out and replaced it with a tree that would grow to fit that location, A, we'd end up with a bigger canopy, and B, we could manage 3.5 of these trees for every 1 pollard, because pollarding is so expensive. So I wouldn't advocate going and removing all your pollards, but I think where you've got trees that are too big, and we had some of this at Bristol when I first arrived. The policy was, would you like to donate money to the city for a tree? Well, then you choose the species and you tell us whereabouts in the park it's going to go, which was mad. We were getting people going, yeah, I want to put a little cherry tree in next to this football pitch. We're like, well, there's space for an oak. So again, it's just, trying to use that professional knowledge and then trying to get engagement. And then beware of engineers and tree money pits. So we were going really well, and then the residents in Redland came to us and said, Russell, we'd like to put a tree in the middle of a roundabout. And I was like, well, how difficult could it be? Massively difficult. It turns out that we didn't have any standardized drawings within our highways department for putting trees in. So I had to pay for those, which I didn't realize. So I met the engineer on site. We came up with a bunch of different designs, and then he issued me a bill for £5,000 to do some nice drawings before we even started digging. And I was like, where's that come from? And it's like, well, we cross-departmentally charge, Russell. That's how much time it's taken. And I'm like, what? To do a drawing, to dig a hole in the ground? How on earth? I haven't even started. And I was in this real difficult position where the residents have raised money to put a tree in, and I'd already blown that on drawings, and we hadn't dug a hole in the ground. So I had to put my hands in my pocket and cover that within my existing budgets. And yeah, that was really difficult. And that kind of, again, brought me back to my, wow, there's lots of money in engineering, isn't there, if they can charge me that much for a drawing? And then I started looking at where all the money was going and started going, well, actually, it's all going into engineering. I think maybe I need to make friends with the engineers. So we've put a tree in, and if I'm honest, I wouldn't have put a plain tree in there. I'd have liked something like a redwood that was more upright. And the reason for that is that plain tree will need management. And the only way to manage that is with traffic management. And traffic management is crazily expensive, because you'd have to divert all the traffic from that roundabout to go in and prune. So it will be an amazing tree. It is an amazing tree. It's doing really well. But professionally, it's one where I'd have liked to have seen something a bit more upright. But the residents were after a plain, so we kind of agreed to go with it. I've talked all the way through about procuring a healthy tree. So on the right is a nursery we work with. Their trees are UK sourced and grown. There are a number of nurseries out there that are saying that our trees are biosecure. And what they mean by that is they've come from abroad and they've been held in a nursery for a year so they can check for pests and diseases. It's not as good as UK sourced and grown, because I had an issue in Bristol where we'd imported loads of plane trees. They come from a Dutch nursery historically, and after 15 years, they all started breaking to pieces because they were growing too quickly, because they weren't used to growing in our climate. They were growing super quick and they were having very weak wood. So, building links with UK nurseries to me is amazing. Some pests and diseases that are coming into the country could take longer than a year to find. So therefore, if it only sits in a nursery for a year, you might not find it. And we've had cases of oak processionary moth being found around the country Cardiff was a high-profile case in Wales, where I'm based, a couple of years ago, where they put massive oak trees from Holland outside the station, and then got slapped with a plant health notification to remove them all within a month because they were covered in oak processionary moth. So again, it's quite risky buying trees from abroad. On the left is our own yard. Now, if you're starting to bring trees in, it's really important to look after them. What you tend to find is that most people haven't really thought about this. The trees arrive, they all get thrown in the corner on top of each other, and then the contractor comes along and pulls them out and throws them aside again to find the right tree for the day. So we set up what they have in nurseries, which are lines. So each of those lines is numbered. Each of those trees gets attached. And so when the contractor comes to pick it out, they know exactly which line the tree is on, and they know which tree they're picking up. And it basically means you're looking after your tree. Each one of those £150 now, you don't want them getting damaged when you first take them off. It's also a really good time to do some basic formative pruning. Okay, even though the nurseries have pruned, you might want to prune slightly higher for footpaths or for highways, and you can do that in the nursery, and it's much cheaper to do it in the nursery when the trees first come in than once the tree is planted. Okay, so again, it's a good time. You can look for double leaders, and I'm a big advocate actually of sort of young tree maintenance with volunteers. And I think this, having a nursery set up to do this, to allow you to do the pruning, is a really cheap way to engage with residents and get people to help you out. And if I'm honest, most arborists, again, they're all taught in college how to climb in big trees and prune big trees. There's very little about pruning little trees. So any way that you can help as residents, and you can sort of you produce a better tree earlier, then that's a cheap way to do it. And yet more branding. We ended up buying, because we went from sort of 100 to 1,200 trees a year. We had to massively expand how we were doing our watering. And so initially we brought bowsers and didn't think about branding them. And we got lots of complaints that trees weren't being watered. And then we put big stickers on saying, please come to our website and sponsor a tree. And it was brilliant, because these would be driving around 5 days a week all over the city. And it was free advertising. And again, it got rid of some of the complaints that trees weren't being watered. So again, a simple message to people showing it's part of the Tree Bristol product, gets things going. And as I say, we went from planting around 100 trees a year to 1,200 trees a year. And that was a challenge. We were using contractors to plant. We were planting with volunteers. We worked with probation services to get them to come out and water and help us maintain. We worked with a charity called Blue Sky. And as you ramp up numbers, you need to think of different ways of doing it. Because to straight give money to a contractor, the contractor will take the money. It's very difficult to then say, are they watering? So I think you need to look, once you get into bigger programs, to go, am I better buying a bowser and giving probation services £10,000 or £15,000 a year to send a team round to water, because that will pay for a supervisor or part of a supervisor's time, and I know those trees are being watered. And we found that meant we were successful, because we looked at different ways of doing things. And then I mentioned about my tree money pit, and then that started making me think, well, I've got loads of residents wanting trees in places I really can't afford it. All the places I've shown you are all nice green areas, or we're replacing into existing pits, but residents want to see trees in hard to build areas, but I just didn't have the budget. So we started looking at where all the money was coming into our highways department. And if we look to Europe, when they do new developments, they integrate the green infrastructure much earlier. So this is from I think it's Freiburg in Germany. And basically, even before they start to build anything, they've put the railway cars in. They've put the trees in. They've started to put the green infrastructure in, so that it can actually come forward at an earlier stage. And I think this is really good. In the UK, we tend to do it last, which means developers leave site, stuff doesn't get as well maintained, and it's much more difficult. So this is a typical green infrastructure in the UK, where we've taken out all the trees so we can put in the large bits of concrete, and then we might put some whips back. So we were saying, well, how can we start to integrate trees? How can we integrate better? And we did this initially looking at our bus routes. Bristol was lucky enough to win £42 million. It was across 4 councils, but the majority of it was going through Bristol. And we had 8 routes. And basically, I kind of was a real pain to our highways guys. And because we'd done all this political stuff, they were saying Russell needs to be at the table. And they kind of gave me £500,000 to kind of like, Russell, shut up, off you go and plant some trees. And we said, well, no, we don't want to do that. We want to work with you. I want to have someone on your project team. I need to understand earlier where these things are coming. We did lose a bit of money in the end because we overspent, but we still ended up getting £450,000 over 2 years to put trees in on bus routes. Now, bearing in mind, across all of our departments, we were only spending £120,000 a year. That was a significant amount of money for us. And it meant that we could start to look at these hard to reach areas. We could start to look at putting in new tree pits as part of this construction. It's much cheaper to go in and put in tree pits when they're already digging up the road or they're already replacing the paving than it is to go in and retrofit. And so the officer there was a guy called Neil, and Neil was basically sat on the transport team for 2 years, and his job was to look for spaces. And it got really good to the point that the engineers then started to find spaces for us in the second year of the project and say, can you find, extra trees? And we were like, yeah, brilliant. That's a great headache to have, is to try and find more trees because you found more spots. And the other reason it's important is because when you deal with these bigger projects, you see all these aspirational drawings, and we're going to have trees and they're going to be every 7 meters. And then they get to site and find it's all full of utilities and you can't do it. So by having an officer who knew about trees on the project team, it meant that when we did open up and excavate, we could go, okay, let's move the tree to there and let's change the species around. And it meant we got lots of new trees in. It meant we also looked at different ways we were working. So this was the Bath Road that goes from Bristol Templemead Station out towards Bath, if you know it. And basically they were looking. Ideally we'd have put trees on the pavements, but there was no space due to services. So when we did the service checks, the only spaces we could find was in the central reservation, which was being built. And we had to fight long and hard because the engineers were like, well, you can't put trees in the middle of the road. Cars will drive into them. There'll be accidents. We'll bring Bristol to a complete standstill due to gridlock. And we're like, really? Really? Where's that ever happened? Prove it to me. Come on. Okay. And then they said, oh, the road keeps flooding. And we said, well, we can put some trees in. Trees suck up water. We can run that water into the tree pits and it will stop the road flooding. And they were like, wow. So I didn't talk about the fluffiness and the trees are lovely for butterflies and the trees are lovely for aesthetics. I was starting to listen to what they wanted, and we designed. So these are Ulmus New Horizon, which is a resistant form of elm tree. And they're really salt tolerant and they grow really, really well. We've gone with the sandy soil here. I'm not a big advocate of sandy soils, but at the time we were having to, I don't know, it was a bit like a negotiation. If we have trees here, then you have to have soil like this, Russell. Okay, so we tried to find a tree that could cope with it. So it was a learning stage for us. So that's why we kind of agreed to go with it. Usually I just would go with a normal topsoil with some biochar added. But we also changed our working practice. So the way things are usually done is the engineers would come and they'd dig up the road and they'd make it all nice and they'd leave my tree pits in a complete mess, full of stone and rubble and beer cans and Pepsi cans. And then I'd have to come and dig it all out and put it in. And that method of working is really expensive because the cones there were costing thousands of pounds a week. And so I'd have had to pay to put extra traffic management in. So we said, hang on a second, can I use your traffic management? Can we come in and put the trees in before you do the final road layer? And they were like, ooh, it's a different way of thinking. And it's like, it's going to say, it's a project, it's going to save the project money. And they were like, yeah, okay, we can see that. And what I also learned is that the sandy soil was a problematic for the highways guys because their final surface of tarmac was designed so that water percolates into it. And if we then fill all those pools with sandy soil, that doesn't work. So they really like this as a concept, and it saved us money. It meant that we had to leave the trees tied up initially until they'd done the final road layer, but it was far cheaper to send a crew along just to cut the bits of string right at the end of the project before they took the cones away than it was to get extra cones in. So it was just a different way of thinking, and those trees have done really well. And we haven't gridlocked Bristol by putting trees in the middle of the road. There hasn't been a mass spate of cars driving at trees. And again, you can see we've used the cages. So again, car drivers like their cars without scratches on. So if you put cages on, realistically, no one's going to run across the middle of that busy road to snap those trees. But the cages act that when an ambulance comes along, the drivers will carefully park their car next to my tree rather than just driving at it to get out of the way of the ambulance, because they don't want to scratch their car. So they've acted there. And then once the trees get to a certain size, they don't tend to drive into trees because it's going to write their car off. So again, it's just a little bit of thinking about, how are we going to stop bringing Bristol to a grind? And basically by working as part of the team, and I also helped a lot in terms of design, trees became part of the scheme. And we don't see this a lot of capital infrastructure projects. And we didn't see, interesting at the same time, Birmingham had the same money. And the statistics are quite interesting. At the end of the project, Birmingham was seeing 2 or 3% increase in passenger traffic where they hadn't done lots of green infrastructure. We were seeing 50% plus on our routes. And so to me, we were starting to get the first ever statistics in the UK to show that if we green our routes, we can bring more people on. And part of that's going to be, we need to make these routes nicer. It's not just about new paving. It's not just about new bus stops. Trees need to be part of it. We need to make these nice environments to people to come to want to see. And Bristol since this has been quoted in peer-reviewed magazines. The Trees in Hard Landscapes document that you'll all be aware of, there's a number of Bristol case studies, and these were the first UK case studies showing practically why this was important to do. And it was quite interesting. As I mentioned at the start of the project, there were 4 authorities and we were the only one tree planting. Halfway through the project, the minister came down to open it and made a comment about how amazing the trees looked at one of the sites. Suddenly it became a bun fight to see who could put the most trees in. And our neighbouring authorities were putting hedgerows in everywhere because they wanted to beat us on numbers. But, you know, we said, nah, we're not about numbers. We're about putting standard trees in that are going to do something in the future. And it's about not being stuck. So a lot of councils run into problems in that they only have 1 or 2 ways to plant, which makes it very easy for engineers to go, I can't build that, Russell. I can't get you 3 cubic meters of soil or 7 cubic meters of soil. So you need to be it needs to be changeable. So here we had an issue where there was a new cycle route going in. There was a large open space to the left. So we said, okay, we'll put a root barrier in along the cycle path to stop it damaging in the future. And we went for pine trees. Pine trees are a great urban tree. Actually, I'd never really come across them until I did a visit down to the south coast. And if you look to the south coast, there are loads of pine trees and street trees, but for some reason we just don't seem to plant them elsewhere. But they are a great tree. However, they are really difficult and expensive. So those trees in the picture are probably only about 3 meters tall, and they will have been about 2 or 3 times the price of a standard tree. So again, there we've caged them up. So whilst the branches will rub against the cages initially, if you think about where the first branches are going to be, those branches are eventually going to be removed. And you know, pine trees at that expense are really prone to being snapped. So again, we just wanted to get the main leaders of those trees up and away, and then when we take the cages off, we'll remove those lower branches that have been damaged because we don't want them there anyway, and the trees up and away. But again, it was just looking and saying, well, what else works elsewhere? How can we diversify? We were blatantly aware in Bristol that a large percentage of our trees were cherries or planes or limes. So we were trying to look to diversify species that we knew could take. And we had to be imaginative. So in the first year, one of the schemes I showed you, so I'll quickly go run back. So this scheme here, so we prepped all these pits ready for a late planting in March. In March, we were told by the engineers, sorry, Russell, we're not ready. And so we went back to the nursery and paid them some extra money to hold the trees. And then in July, I got this phone call going, right, we're ready for your trees. And it was right in the middle of the heat wave. It was one of the first early heat waves we'd had. And I'm like, I can't plant in July. It's a heat wave. They're going to die. These are big trees. And they're like, no, Russell, you don't understand. I'm the client and the minister's coming next week to open this route. And your trees are the last things that need to go in. So you need to get them here this week and we need to get them in. And so we did. We got them there. We planted. We did extra watering. The minister came, went, wow, the trees are amazing. And then a week later, we started getting complaints because the trees were starting to droop. So the engineers here, they'd opened a shop. And so they were, one of the shops was basically open for public engagement. And so all the shopkeepers came and went, you know, you've been destroying our livelihoods for 18 months by doing all this building work. You finally put some nice trees in and people are stopping to shop here. And now they're dying. What are you going to do? And it was an eye-opening experience to the engineers because they didn't really believe us that if you plant in July, the tree's going to die. So we did extra watering in the mornings. We also gave all of the businesses watering cans. And I've done this ever since. It was a real simple thing, actually. I don't know why I never really thought about it before. And there was a guy called Rupert Bentley Walls up in Camden, and sorry, it's Camden, one of the London boroughs anyway. And he had been giving out watering cans, and I'd never really thought about it. And then it just came with this scheme, and we said, well, watering cans they're like a £5 each. You know, we've probably just spent £10,000 or £15,000 putting these trees in. So if we give out 20 watering cans, it's not really much money. And actually, all the shopkeepers and the engineers in the shop came out every morning and started watering those trees. And so now actually we do that with all of our community projects is watering cans are included as part of the project because it's a great way of getting a buy-in. You know, it's a great way of getting engagement. So when we came the following year to the same thing that the pits weren't ready, we said, can we tarmac over them and we'll come back and plant them in the winter? And then we started getting more complaints. You know, why haven't you finished the paving? Because there's these black horrible pots, you know, that haven't been done. So the guy Neil came up with this, and we called it our tree Banksy. So you know, Banksy was a big Bristol graffiti artist who goes and sprays everywhere. So basically, Neil came up with some stencils, which was Tree Bristol planting here soon, and we put those on all these tree pits, and our complaints disappeared overnight because we'd explained to people there was a tree coming, we just couldn't do it now. And so it was a simple thing, and it made a massive difference. And again, you know, if you I gave my officers a lot of ability to go off and do their own things, and they came up with some amazing ideas as a result. And then finally we came to White Ladies Road, and White Ladies Road was the last scheme, probably the most difficult. And for those of you that know Bristol, it runs from the Downs down into the city centre. It was a large traffic corridor, full of buses, 4 to 5 car widths wide, and there was a big push to get more cyclists out. And the cycle, Sustrans and everyone else was saying, well, we want to see dedicated cycle routes, we want to see dedicated cycle lanes, and we were saying, well, we want to see trees. And there was a lot of conflict, actually, because the only place we could get trees in was the middle of the road, but you couldn't have cycle lanes and tree pits. So we pulled out a lot of research from the state saying, look, if we put trees in longer term, they'll slow down traffic. We can show you that, once the trees get up and above the canopy, once the trees get covering the road, traffic will slow. It's that tunnel effect. If you ever drive along a country road and you come to sort of, woodlands, you automatically slow down without realizing it, because it feels like you're entering a tunnel. So we said, look, we can use these for a tunnel effect. If traffic isn't going quickly anyway, what's happening is it stops starty, so everyone's rushing to get to the next set of traffic. So if we can make the traffic flow more even, it will make it a nicer place. We also said we want to plant trees in the middle of the road. And look, that other scheme, we didn't bring Bristol to a standstill. None of those trees have been driven into, so can we have bigger pits? And we got bigger pits, and the highways engineers worked with us actually and went against Sustrans and said, well, we're not going to put in dedicated cycle routes. We've been shown all this research. We've been working now with these guys for 2 years, and actually, where they've worked with us, it's made it much easier to get schemes agreed. And so we got these much bigger pits, which was amazing. And we started using them to delineate crossing points. So we said, well, look, if drivers know that when they approach a couple of trees, it's likely that it's linked to a crossing point, they'll slow down, it'll be safer. I lost a few battles. I didn't, the highway code says that engineers have to put in these keep left signs pretty much every 100 meters, which was, taking up space. And I don't get it, because we drive on the left-hand side. Why do I need a little sign in my tree pit taking up soil space? What I hadn't realized, though, is I gave a talk to Department for Transport about a year after we opened this scheme. And they said, have you got away with that, Russell? I went, got away with what? I went, well, according to our standards, you need a massive uplighter next to that little blue sign so that people can see it. And I'm like, what, really? Okay, so I went and talked to our engineers, and they went, well, yeah, you do, but there's so much light there anyway. We just thought we'd take that out because you keep banging on about needing more space for your roots, and we didn't want to take up another cubic meter of your soil. So I was like, oh, result, you didn't tell me that. So by speaking each other's languages, in languages we understood, the engineers still weren't interested in fluffy, nice trees and this, that, and the other, but they were interested in accidents. They were interested in speed reduction. They were introduced in, people's safety. And we ended up with an amazing result, and something I'm really proud of, to be honest, because this is the route where, when the statistics came in, showed that bus patronage had gone up by 50% compared to cities like Birmingham, where similar schemes had gone in without this green infrastructure and they'd gone up by 3. And that was massive. That engineers love that, to the point, actually, for the first year, the bus route company didn't want us to publicize this, because they didn't want their competitors realizing that suddenly this was a really lucrative route. The other thing was, it changed we decreased the number of accidents. The statistics show that we got more cyclists out on the routes. I think it was like 13% more cyclists started to use it because they felt safer. The businesses were over the moon. This won an award from the local civic society because the businesses all said, this is amazing. Before we did this, it was a bit of a nightclubby. There was kebab shops on one side, there were clubs on the other side. We changed the whole character. Shops that have been derelict for years came back into use. We saw a cafe culture. We had expanded the pavements as well. So we started to see that. So it completely changed the use of this road. And it made it a lot easier. And I think that's what the engineers took away, was actually, if we plant trees on these schemes and they're successful, it makes it a lot easier for us to agree them. And so finally, the last thing with Bristol was that what we also showed was that, because this perception that people are going to drive into trees wasn't true, the engineers now, whenever they do a new build out, they put a tree in instead of a bollard. So bollards are designed that when cars run at them, they break, okay, because that's how they've been designed for traffic safety. And we said, well, that's ludicrous, because you have to keep replacing them. Went, yeah, it's really expensive. And I'm like, so we've shown you that if you put a tree in the middle of a build out, nobody drives over it. Good point. So now basically in Bristol, yeah, every time they do a build out, if they can get a tree in, if there are no services, they do. And so that's a way that we're getting new tree pits pretty much for free as part of all these schemes, and that's saving an absolute fortune. I left Bristol about 6 years ago, and I set up on my own as a consultant about 3 years ago. And I said there's now 3 of us working together, and we work with groups. And what I'm now trying to do is take some of these lessons learned from Bristol, and we're trying to help other groups. And to be honest, it's the same issues everywhere. It really is. We work with a group called Save Our Street Trees in Northampton, and they again had noticed that most of the street trees were missing. It's lots of terraces in Northampton. The lady there in the middle is Alice, who's the kind of leader, founder of the group, and she's been desperately trying to get street trees back on our streets. And we've had the same issues here in that there's no tree officer in Northampton. It's all the highways own the highway, but they subcontract it to the borough council. The borough council hasn't got any money, and even if they did, they'd have to get the county council's permission to plant trees, and who's going to want to do that? And it's an absolute minefield. And it took us about 2.5 years to get the first set of trees in. And the other issue is because they don't have a tree officer and because they don't really have any experience of doing it, the amounts they're paying to their contractors are absolutely horrific. And I think this is why with any community group, working along with your city tree officers is really important to look at things like this. We've done 2 years worth of planting with Save Our Streets, and from year 1 to year 2, the price has doubled because they don't have a standard schedule of rates. The contractor can kind of just make up the prices, and we're kind of beholden to it. So this year, actually, with that group, we are doing some orchard planting and some schools planting until we try and fix this issue, because it was just getting prohibitively expensive. But again, this is an example of where the residents were desperate for street trees. There was lots of lobbying of local politicians. They raised money. Councillors put money in out their own environmental pots, and we've actually seen 40 trees, I think it is now, back in the street, and it's made a massive difference. But again, when in the second year, so we did the first year, we did all the permits and all that, and then in the second year, the permits hadn't come through. So we spoke to a highways officer who said, well, but you're putting in hornbeam. They get like 50 meters wide, don't they? Why on earth are you putting a hornbeam in? It's going to get 50 meters wide in the street. And we're like, well, no, we've gone for a very tight, narrow, upright hornbeam that doesn't. It gets 3 or 4 meters wide. We've been very careful. So again, engineers' perceptions of trees can be very different if we haven't taken them on that journey with us. And so, we are seeing this again and again and again. We saw the same in Sheffield, where the engineers didn't understand the benefits of the trees. They were looking at it as if it was a lamppost, and you replace a lamppost every 15 years. So why wouldn't you do that with a tree? So again, we need to explain to these engineers why trees are different. Why are they different? And again, it's about trying to get as much publicity. Alice is amazing at publicity. She's amazing at bringing local people together. Her group works really well at trying to bring different groups together. And we get the politicians out again just for photos. And now they are starting to work together to try and look at this. They're going to produce a tree strategy. They're looking at, they've got a strategic tree working group at a political level, cross-party, to try and look at some of these issues. And hopefully in the next year, with some support from the Woodland Trust, they'll get their first tree officer, which will be, a really positive step to start to look at some of these things. And then we've been doing some work recently with Eastport Talbot, and there it was a case of lots of schools, and you do see this across the UK, is that as schools have been privatized by becoming academies, there's less and less trees going in, because whereas before the local authority would have provided that, academies have kind of got their own pots of money. They're off doing their own things. And so, there's a lot of opportunity in schools to plant. And so when we come in, we go and we talk to the schools, we talk to the teachers, and we try and design. So we try and put standard trees in for shade, and then in the background, we've been putting some hedgerows in. We did try some new cardboard guards about a year ago on this scheme. Unfortunately, they all didn't last. Within 6 months they were falling to pieces, so we had to replace them with plastic ones. So as a company, we're always looking to try and be a bit more sustainable. But some of the products that are out there at the moment, just be wary, are not living up to their expectations. So I'd always be wary of new products and trying them on a mass scale. Always try them in a small scale and move on. But again, it's about empowering these kids. So some of these are some of the poorest areas in Eastport Talbot. So this is where statistics is quite interesting. So if you look at Eastport Talbot's eye tree, basically it looks like one of the top most 20 leafy places to live in the country. that's because it's surrounded by valleys that are within the geographical boundary that are full of woodlands. If you go into Eastport Talbot, it's got a steel mill and a rolling mill, and it's full of pollution. So actually, the council there were really keen to work with us to try and get stuff in for air pollution and air quality. But again, we worked with each school. In some places we did put woodlands, but in most of the cases, what they wanted was new hedgerows for wildlife, new hedgerows for screening, and standard trees for shade. So again, it's just about working with it. And that's a picture that looks more like how most of the children leave our planting schemes, absolutely filthy. But they had an amazing time. And buy kit, buy kids spades. It's buy kids gloves, help them out with things. We've even got to the case we've had to buy wellies for some places because we've gone into some areas where parents can't afford wellies. So we'll take a selection of wellies with us. We take the gloves. We provide the spades, and that's just what we do, because that can be the biggest barrier. If you're a head teacher with no funding, just bringing trees, if you can't bring extra equipment to help plant it, means that they probably can't work with you. So something to think about. And we need to inspire the next generation. I think that is the key thing to me. You may not be aware that we've lost probably 4 or 5 colleges and university courses in the UK over the last 10 years. Aberdeen used to teach forestry, it's no longer teaching forestry. Edinburgh used to teach forestry, it's no longer teaching forestry. Plumpton is currently not teaching at a high level for arboriculture. Sparsholt has stopped its higher educational courses. We are in a real bind at the moment as a sector. We're kind of where engineering was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, if you went to a dinner party, a parent would not say that my son or daughter wants to be an engineer. It was seen as a dirty, filthy job that was low paid. Whereas now engineering is really sexy. If you go to a dinner party, my Janet's going to be an engineer. My Dion's going to be an engineer. And we need to inspire that next generation, but we also need to cut through to parents. What I see time and time again is that those people that are coming into the sector are kind of fighting against peer pressure. They're fighting against parental pressure to look to be a banker or an engineer or something like that. And we need to make tree planting and trees the next thing that people want to do. And that's really important. I've done a number of these schemes where it's the first time kids have got out and got dirty. Engaging with these youngsters is really important. Hopefully we'll inspire the next David Attenborough. Hopefully we'll have more people coming through. And it's the right time to do it. We're seeing lots of people going on climate marches, but how can you engage with those? Please, can you engage with those groups to come out and do tree planting? Because actually, I think that's where we need the change, and that's where we need the change to push the politicians. So that's it for me. There's my email. I'm happy to answer questions. Hopefully that was okay. And I guess I'll hand back to the chair.
Brilliant. Russell, thank you so much. That was amazing. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the comments as they were coming in, but
I didn't know, sorry, because I just had my presentation up. Sorry.
No, I mean, it's fine. I've got things like best presentation ever, fantastic, really good. So you've
Cool,
been so inspiring. So thank you. There are about 3,000 questions though. So if I can just sort of, I've been summarising them as I've been going through the chat. So one of them was about Natural England. They're adding community engagement part of their inclusion strategy. Do you think will have any impact? Does that help?
Anything politically that changes things is good. I think we've seen the government cutting green tape. So I in the last 10 years, I think our planning policies got weaker. If you look at tree preservation orders, the fines have not kept up with land values. £20,000 to a developer now for a tree is nothing when you're selling a £500,000 house. And it's really difficult as a local authority to get those prosecutions because they lack staff, and actually the pandemic I think has been quite difficult because a lot of officers have been told to work at home, so they're not doing site visits. And it's when you're doing those site visits that you see something's going wrong, you see the fencing's being moved. So we need to keep ramping this up. Politicians, we need to make sure they don't water down what we have left, and I think they need to make it stronger. So anything like that is positive, basically.
Okay, that's great, thank you. How in your experience in Bristol and other places, how can you make sure that contractors do actually look after trees? You were saying that it might be in their contract they've got to carry on watering, but how do you monitor that?
So I've always gone out and taught my new contractors how to plant trees. I spent a couple of weeks with them to make sure they know how to plant trees the way I want. And I think my boss at the time was like, "You're doing what for 2 weeks?" It's like, no, it's really important. They're going to be planting lots of trees for us. I want to make sure they're doing it right. And then if they're not, if I've shown them how to do it, they can't really turn around and say no. Watering is the key one where I think it's very difficult. So some of the things you can do is we're looking to work through our software now to potentially add QR codes, so that basically, you know, technology has moved on massively so that they can QR code in and out when they've been to a tree. And, you know, and you can then go, hang on a second, if you're QR coding them every minute, there's no way you're giving that tree the water. So again, you know, that's helpful. Otherwise, historically, we used to do things like we used to put a bit of tissue, you know, near where they're watering and come back and see if the tissue was still dry. But, you know, technology has massively moved on that, you know, you can see where they are, you can see when they're date timing and stamping, and then recognize that contractors can only do so much. So I think that's where, if your programs get bigger, look for other ways to water. You know, I showed Bowser's. Now, realistically, with the transit van, you can get one of these IBC containers that are like a cubic meter of water. They bring palm oil, olive oil and things in. You know, you can put one of those in the back of a truck now, and you can drive around with that on it, and you can get, I don't think you know, I don't see why you can't have residents out watering. They need training, but councils have insurance, and as long as they know what they're doing, you know, I wouldn't put them on major highways, but I'd put, you know, cul-de-sacs and places like that. Why wouldn't you have residents out? You know, and the watering cans again. You know, if you're spending £500 on a tree, giving out 2 or 3 watering cans per tree could be one of the best investments you've ever made. It's an extra £15. You know, for a city of your size, you're then buying 1,000. It would be even cheaper. So, you know, just little things like that, and that then encourages people to water, and you know, you can start to look at, you know, can you report that the tree's not looking very good? We're doing a bit of work at the moment where we're trying to get some sensors in so that it will start to ping to say the tree needs a water. So that's something we're looking at. But at the moment, the costs are quite prohibitive. So we're looking at trying to see, you know, whether we can do that. Someone said in the chat that you can add, you know, please water me. You know, little signs on your guard saying, please give me some extra water, because some people might not realize they're allowed to. There was a big urban myth years ago that, you know, if I cleared the snow off my street and someone fell over, I'd get sued. It's rubbish. You know, in the same way that, you know, if you water the tree, the council's not going to tell you off. Why the council? You know, I have come across a case recently in London where they're not allowing residents to water the trees because they need a highways permit. And I'm like, really? Why? So challenge. If you come across a barrier that seems wrong, challenge it. And if it still seems wrong, go to your councillors and go, this is stupid. Come on, help us out. You know, we're all in this together, I think, at the end of the day. So it's looking for creative solutions and copy other people. You don't have to make new things up. Look for where things are working and copy them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Recording in progress.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought that was somebody else getting a question there. Somebody said that in their area, the contractors are tarmacking right up to the base of the tree. Is that something you've seen?
It's a big issue. It's a big issue, and it's an issue. I'm getting a bit of echo. Someone got to speak.
Yeah, let me see who's not on mute.
I'll try again. Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
Okay, so so it's a big issue for new trees. If I'm honest, new trees will be getting some of the water from their tree pit probably in the first 5 years, but realistically after that, I think that the tree is most likely to be getting through from underground, and that water coming down the stem is less problematic. However, yeah, tarmacking up to trees isn't good because it could basically, you know, heat the cambium of the tree up. And it then gives the tree something else to push against, which can on smaller trees lead to girdling. So it's not good practice. We work with our highways engineers to agree to use a type 1 stone. So it's a mixture of sand and gravel that binds together, and basically that allows water to percolate in, and that would be my preferred option. So again, I think if you're seeing that and you're worried about it, I would be talking to your highways engineers and councillors to go, this is problematic for the trees. Please, can we look at getting this specification changed?
Right. Okay. I had somebody asking about council policies and kind of, you know, if you've got one political party in power who are very pro trees and they're saying this, it's fine, but then obviously after an election it might be a different political party who might have a different emphasis and want to change the policies and take trees out because they're prioritising roads or development. How do you try and stop that happening? How do you build in trees so that they can't be taken out?
So we need to be more political. I think that's the key thing. Is as a sector we haven't done engagement. At Bristol, I ended up with what I would call a political champion on each of the parties. So I worked very closely with all of my councillors. I was being apolitical, but at the same time, I was subconsciously lobbying my councillors. You know, prior to that, my previous tree officers probably hadn't been that. I was quite not in your face, I guess. I was quite engaging with politicians, and that's really important because if they don't know what you're doing, it's very easy to go make a cut to that department. I don't know what they do. So get politicians to come along to all your events. You know, invite everybody, and what you'll find is if one of them knows one party's going, the others will go just to be there as well. So you know, that's a really good way of doing it. But if you're still not getting anywhere, become a politician. I've seen this in Sheffield. It's been really interesting is that a number of members of Stag, the group there, are now standing for election. They're that hacked off with the councillors not listening to what they've said. A number of them have got elected, and you know, Sheffield's gone from being predominantly Labour to now being mainly Green. And I've come across it in recent years, and we've got it in Swansea. The Labour Party, and it's not, they're all, some of the parties are all about each other. This isn't just about Labour, but Labour seem to run this thing called a strong leader model, whereby politically the leader of the council and the top 4 or 5 politicians kind of state where the council is going, and the other councillors kind of kowtow to it. And that can be really problematic, as we saw in Sheffield, where you've got a leader of the council who's hell-bent on, we're going to take these trees out, even if it's the wrong thing. So, you know, again, by having cross-political support for tree planting, and tree planting is much easier, I think, to get support for than tree management, then it's up to those other parties to try and keep the ruling party in line. But then, you know, if it is still failing, you know, we've seen it in Sheffield, seek change. You know, if you'd have told me 5 years ago that Labour were going to lose Sheffield, I'd have been like, no way, they've got 90% of the seats. Now they are controlling up just over 50%. And we've now seen a cross political group now in Sheffield for the first time ever. So okay, so Chrissy, yeah, I guess it's a case of she's saying the same issue down in Coventry. So I think again, you've just got to work with everybody, but get political a lot longer and a lot quicker. Sheffield didn't want to get political because they didn't think they had to, and I think it's something the groups learn, and it's something we're seeing with other groups is you just have to get more political. So yeah.
Okay, that's good advice for us all, I think. One of the other questions that kind of related to that was a policy around trees going into housing developments, and that's fine, but the trees were actually ending up in private land. They weren't going on the public land in the housing development, and then they weren't being cared for. So whether they actually ended up in people's back gardens or on their front lawns, and then they weren't being cared for. Is that an issue to come across?
Yeah, so there's an issue generally with housing developments, full stop, in that you tend to find the landscaping is the last thing to happen. So if they've overspent elsewhere, the landscaping is always being pushed and pushed and pushed to be reduced. So one of the things we did in Bristol is we started to offer developers the opportunity that where trees were coming onto our land, we would take additional money and we would adopt the land earlier and we would plant the trees. It gave us more control. From a developer's perspective, it meant that they could get rid of the land quicker, so they were happy with that. But it was quite a difficult model. I did talk to Kevin McLeod's design team with his little housing company, because we had said to them, how about going in and offering to do a community planting with the residents? Unfortunately, they went bankrupt, so that didn't kind of come to fruition. But I am talking to another couple of housing developers to say, you know, could we do this? And I think if you've got housing associations, and I'm down seeing a housing association with the group in Swansea on Monday, you know, we are going to offer to them as part of a new development to say, can we come in and do a community planting with you? And I think because people don't, for a lot of people, trees aren't top of their priority list. You know, some of them are, you know, hand to mouth from day to day. So I think if you can go in and find how, you know, housing associations will be really open to this from what I'm seeing. If you can go in and say, look, we'd like to work with you, we'd like to do community events, you know, residents will get to meet each other. We can teach them about how to look after their trees, because probably it's just a lack of, they don't understand. You know, they don't understand the benefits of having it. So, you know, if you are stuck in that, can you do that engagement earlier? Can you do your plantings, community plantings, but through the housing group or something like that? So I'd look at that. That's what we're looking at on Monday with the Swansea group.
Right. Okay, that's good. And there's also been some question about hedges. So kind
Yep.
of what's your feeling about hedges? Because there was a comment about could hedges go in central reservations along with the trees? Was that an issue about the trees or the engineers?
They can do. The issue then becomes about maintenance. So once your hedge has got to a certain point, you've got to come back and prune it, and then you have to put traffic management in, and traffic management costs a lot of money. So where the ones we did at White Ladies, we designed for low maintenance shrubs. So whilst they weren't going to be high hedges, there was ground cover that was going in. But the idea was it was low maintenance so that we didn't have to keep coming back, because traffic management can just cost an absolute fortune. So there's research out there that shows hedges are great, and basically the closer you've got vegetation to a road, the more it picks up. But I think you need to be looking to put it in places that you can reach. So if you've got a highway, then you've got paving, and then you've got a grass strip, then maybe put hedgerows along there that are kept at a decent height, because they'll pull in some of the pollution. But I think it's about practicalities of, can we maintain the stuff? There's no point in putting these things in if we can't maintain in the future, because they won't get maintained. And that's why we were looking. So there are a lot of redwoods now in roundabouts in Bristol, because we put them in, because we said, okay, now that we can put trees, because we were initially told you can't put trees in the middle of a roundabout because cars will drive into them. We're like, well, hang on a second, you've got all these signs around the roundabout going keep left, and they don't get knocked in much, do they? So let's put trees in. And again, it's just little bit by little bit. You try with one scheme, it works. If it doesn't work, you try again.
Right. Okay. That sounds, yeah. It sounds you've just got to be so resilient, haven't you? And just kind of keep going and not give up.
Yeah.
Which, to be honest, for a lot of our tree wardens, that's just what they're like.
Yeah.
They just keep going and keep campaigning and keep planting trees. So yeah. There was quite a lot in the chat about where to buy children's wellies and tools. And
so please look at our website, because we do children's wellies and tools and things like that. And so that's woodlanddwelling.co.uk. We work with a number of companies, Breers we use for wellies and gloves, and we're a Bulldog supplier for spades. So we found that people weren't able to find stuff. Please ignore the pricing on the website. We have to assume that people buy in ones. If you want to buy in bulk, just email us and we'll give you a better quote, because postage for one item is the same as it is for 10. It's just crazy. So if by all means, please contact us afterwards.
Oh no, that's really good. We've got quite a lot of forest school leaders who are tree wardens, because they mesh really well together. So yeah, it's a particular thing that we're interested in. We've also got somebody who's asking about faith groups and engaging faith groups. And certainly in Birmingham, we've been working with the Muath Trust, which is a mosque, about planting trees on their site. This is Sub just asking about which organisations would you suggest about engaging with for tree planting, in terms of I know the Heart of England Forest, you can go and have day there.
So look for organisations. I'm always a big fan of working locally, and Heart of England Forest is a good organisation that does a lot of local work. So I would always look to try and work with organisations locally, and then look to engage with organisations where you've got projects close to them. So we worked with a lot of faith groups, but we kind of would look to work with the ones closest to those various different parks. And sometimes, because of their faith, you need to run a separate day for them, because that's what they ask for. So sometimes we would run multiple events because that faith group only felt comfortable bringing out their children in their group. And you just have to go, okay, that's fine. We'll do that in the same way that we did with probationary kids. It's the same sort of thing. So listen to what will help them come to you, I think, is my advice. And if it means you have to slightly change what you do, then change what you do.
That's brilliant. Great. Okay. I think I've been through most of the questions in the chat, unless anybody wants to pipe up with one that I've missed. There's been a lot in the chat, and people have been really helpful and been putting in links to other websites, links to documents. So I'll see if we can keep the chat as well, because I think we can do that as well.
It should be auto-saving.
Oh, will it? Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it should do. I'll double check. Does I need to save it or not?
Okay.
And there quickly, if people just need our details, there's my details if they want to quickly jot stuff down for future reference.
Thank you, Russell. That's great. Okay.
That's all right.
Oh my gosh, I think my brain is popping. The things that were coming out for me was somebody put in the chat, education, education, education. I
Yes.
think
Sorry, Tanya, that was me.
Russell, you said challenge, challenge, challenge.
Yeah.
And at one point I'd just written communication, 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 because it's all about us all working together, isn't it? And I mean, I think we've got some challenges there. We need to try and get more kids to want to be foresters or arboriculturalists or whatever, and to get more people trained. We need to get more people interested. There's just so much we've got to do, but it's a challenge.
I think it's a challenge, but it's a very warming challenge when you have success. And I think the other thing I would say with yourselves is because you've got the West of Midlands Combined Transport Authority.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of money going into that organisation. You know, if you're not already engaging with them, you need to be really engaging at a high level to show them how you can help them as an organisation deliver.
Luckily, Russell, the managing director for TFWM, used to be my boss. So
okay, good.
I have a good route in there.
Brilliant.
And not just for Birmingham, but we're talking about the wider combined authority as well. So seeing what they can be doing. I mean, they've started looking at other biodiversity issues that they can help deal with. So they've got something like 5,000 bus shelters across the network. So they've started looking at putting some green roofs on a couple. So they've done, I think, a couple in Coventry and at Halesoe. So I think those trials and see how they can roll that out. But yeah, I've been working with them on one of the big bus rapid transit systems, the sprint route, which will go from Walsall through to the airport in Birmingham. So we have had some tree removals and that, but we're getting I think we've had something like 400 come out, but we're getting 1,540 back in.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
As part of that, and they're funding the whole of that. So
no, that's really
good. Yeah, we need to take those professions with us. I thought the stats were in here, but they're not. But yeah, I think DEFRA's budget a couple of years ago was 2.2 billion. Department for Transports was 20 billion base budget, and that was then they were given extra stuff. So in the same year that DEFRA got 60 million pounds to spend on trees, you know, Department for Transport got 800 million to fix potholes. You know, they got 500 million to upgrade local transport routes. So I've just done a chapter for a book with the group in Sheffield, and my chapter's kind of about, you know, is DEFRA any good? Is it just there to fob us off and waste our time? Should we really be lobbying these bigger departments because that's where the money is? I'm not saying don't take the money from DEFRA, but actually when you look at where the money is in central government, you know, that's where the money is. And then, you know, Department for Health is 147 billion pounds a year. It's just crazy. So, you know, what my aspiration, what I'd love to see in my lifetime is that actually trees and parks come under health. You know, we know that they help with health, and actually, you know, most of them have been heavily cut because they're not a statutory service. I think they need to be rolled under health as a statutory service, because I think, you know, if we look at how much we're spending on drugs versus how much we could spend on health walks and improving our parks, we could make a massive saving. So I think there's a, yeah, that in my lifetime is something I'd love to see.
Yeah,
Oh, well,
I mean that last bit, Russell, that's sort of the direction that our Future Parks Accelerator has been taking in Birmingham. Is, you know, it's been led by public health, but it's looking at how those other sectors can help fund these improvements, not just in parks, but across the whole environment. You know, improving health and well-being through different activities, and greening streets, and engaging more in parks and open spaces.
Yeah. No, well, we'll all have to start campaigning for that and just talking and engaging with professionals, isn't it, Russell? That's what we need. That's brilliant. I'd like to thank you so much, Russell. That's an amazing, inspirational talk with loads of food for thought.